Hello and welcome to this webinar on unnecessary travel, lessons from the pandemic and opportunities for change. I'm very happy to be able to facilitate this webinar that is co-hosted by New Weather Sweden and the Rapid Transition Alliance. And together today we have really interesting speakers, and we also have quite a lot of space for questions in the end of the webinar. So we record this webinar, and I hope this is okay for everyone. And you as attendees, you can all through, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and Freddie, who's with us, he will help us with highlighting them. And as I said, we'll also have more time for them in the end of the webinar. And we'll get both researchers, activists, political views on this issue. Yes, I think we should just start off. Well, Nicky, because you have Nicky Saunter from the Rapid Transition Alliance. You've been working with this issue quite a lot with perspectives on the pandemic and how we can learn from the lessons. So you do an intro on what you've done and your perspectives, your thoughts. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping Freddie's going to put some slides up for me on the screen. Yes, it's been an interesting time, hasn't it? So thank you very much to Anna for putting together this this event. And I want to really run through just quickly what the Rapid Transition Alliance does. So we're a network of organisations. We are an alliance. We work globally. We have about between 160 and 170 organisations at the moment coming together to share information about how we work together towards a sustainable and just future. Next slide, please, Freddie. And our main, sorry, back one. Yeah, the main issue that we're looking at, it really is to do with the fact that the climate is changing faster than we are. And what do we do about that? And obviously today's discussion is part of that, as continuing that conversation. Next slide. Thank you. So to summarise what rapid transition means to us as an organisation, it's talking about evidence, what we call evidence-based hope. And we rather like that little phrase because it says everything about what we do. We tend to look for what works rather than we do provide critique, but we're always looking for what works. And we're sitting somewhere between journalism and media and academia. So we're looking at proper evidence rather than just rumour or transient ideas. We're looking at things that really work at the speed and scale that's necessary for change. And we like to put those forward as stories. So we really like to use the fact that stories in the humane to try and encourage people to remember these things that work, these good stories of change, and to share them. It's important that our work respects and promotes social justice, and as Anna said, we've been working recently with some on a particular body of work funded by Climate Works Foundation, looking at lessons that we've learned from the pandemic. And that has resulted in quite a body of content that we've put together, ourselves and our partners across the world, a series of briefings, short films and graphics, and all those are available for you to share, all open source, and we hope that you'll have a look at them after this. Apologies at the moment, I've got lovely sunshine coming in across my screen. It looks like a bit like the hand of God coming in from the side. Can I have the next slide, please? So looking back at transport throughout the pandemic, I thought it just might be useful to sort of remind ourselves, because it seems like so much has happened since then and continues to happen. Of course, you know, the pandemic continues, of course, even today across the world. But this is a reminder, an image taken in India in the early days of when transport first stopped. Although there are many, many difficult and tragic things that happened to a lot of people across the world during the pandemic, looking just at the point of view of some of the benefits to do with unnecessary travel. And when we stopped traveling, you can see it right here on the screen: blue skies, clean air. And that was something that was commented on right across the world. We forget how many people are touched by air pollution, for example. And looking up at those big blue skies, we realised that we don't see them very often. Next slide, please. And this is another reminder of something that happened pretty much immediately. As soon as people started realising they weren't going to fly, they perhaps were going to travel around their local area. They weren't, at the time, the beginning of the pandemic, particularly, people felt more hesitant about public transport, but obviously in the long term, public transport is a very good thing for us all and for sustainability. But what it did do was got a lot of people out walking and cycling, and it made changes almost immediately to our streets. People either took over bits of the street and made them into cycling areas, or the municipal authorities soon realised that that was necessary because of the traffic. And so we actually had changes at the street level, real change that happened and was successful, and some of those changes have stayed in place and caused a huge boost in cycling. Next slide. This I thought was just quite fun because it reminds us again of the fact that bikes aren't just for biking around, they can also be for transporting. Because I think it's very brave when people cycle their children around towns, because it's not always very easy. But this is a great example of a cargo bike put to good use, how these are becoming more common on our streets. Next slide. And this shows the other use for it. The last mile travelled is in many countries around the world a particularly polluting part of our transport system. And this shows what you can do, particularly in a city environment, transporting using green energy, either electric bikes or push bikes that are very well, very well geared if the area is flat enough. But it really is a viable commercial transport option. Next slide. This is just a little reminder to sort of cast us back into that time where, of course, in some countries, like in China at the moment, a lot of people are still under lockdown and trapped in their homes. And what happened to lots of us, people who are lucky enough to be able to go on holiday, then had to basically make do with being with their own family in their own space or in an outside local shared space. And people's imaginations really came to the fore, and they basically had what we started calling a staycation. And I think that is a trend which probably will continue, even if it continues into being more local travel and more shorter breaks, people learning to look at their own environment, get to know their own place, their own country, their own region. Next slide.
I say 1 minute, Nicky.
I think this is the last but one. And this is, of course, a big, big change that has stuck with us, which has had a big impact on travel, and that is home working. So lots of us sitting on this call here will all be home working, and it has had a huge impact, possibly connected, making other ideas such as the 4-day week become also more possible. But the flexibility that has come with that obviously is downsides for lots of people, and lots of people also aren't able to homework simply because of the nature of their job. But it has had a huge impact on cutting travel. Next slide. I just wanted to bring your attention to these short briefings that we put together, which are all available, downloadable in PDF form. They're very accessible, they're easy, they're sort of 4 to 6 pages. And please do have a look at them on the website and feel free to use them. They cover all these areas that I've covered and more. Next slide. Is there one last one? The last slide is simply saying, if you're not a member of the Alliance, please join us. We love to have you on board, and we're always looking for suggestions of other partners, whether it's something that you can use the Alliance to share the content and to share your activities, or whether you want to use the content that we put out and get to know more about the issues through the wider network. We would love to have you on board. And I look forward to hearing from the rest of you.
Thank you so much, Nicky. I do have a question for you, but I will take it after Doug, since Doug has to leave a bit early because of my mistake with winter time. So I say very, very welcome. And also thank you to Nicky, and who will stay on. And welcome to Doug Gordon, who's co-host for the War on Cars podcast. I love that name. I just need to say that. And also New York project lead of the Car Free Megacities Campaign. I'm very delighted to have you here and to give some examples of what happened in New York.
Thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen. So hold on just a second. All right. Uh, hold on just a sec. There we go. Can you all see that? Great. Okay, yeah, so again, my name's Doug Gordon. I'm the co-host of a podcast called The War on Cars. Don't let the name scare you. The War on Cars is what people say when you try to actually make streets better for people who are cycling, taking transit, or walking. If you remove so much as one parking space, you're often accused of waging a war on cars. So I'm also the project lead for the Car Free Megacities Campaign, which is highlighting work done in Paris, London, and New York to make streets and cities better for people who are not in cars. I thought I would talk a little bit about just, how car-free in New York City is compared to other world capitals. If you see Manhattan, which most people are familiar with, nearly 80% of households in New York City in Manhattan are car-free, and that's pretty remarkable, even compared to the center of London or sort of the center of Paris proper. So we have a head start, even if we don't really have necessarily the European style transit that Paris and London and other cities have. We have a great subway system, but it's not without its problems. Sorry, hold on just a second. For some reason, there we go. And so, like I said, New York City as a whole is over 50% car free, and the median income of homes without vehicles is lower than those with. So, this is an economic justice issue to move our cities towards making it easier to get around without a car, because most people, especially lower income people, don't have one. This is just my neighborhood alone is 55% car free. I'm one of those car free households. So as I said, there's really a sort of economic justice, spatial justice component to all of this, because if you were to go outside of my apartment right now, 55.8% of the street space is not devoted to non-car uses. Nearly 100% of the street is devoted to cars. We've made some progress over the years. This is the growth of our bike lane network over about 20 years. This is actually the most updated thing we have. There's been far more since 2017. A lot of these are painted lanes, but in Manhattan, we have a big network of protected bicycle lanes, which has really spurred a lot of bicycle travel. Many of you are probably familiar with the changes to our iconic Times Square right in the middle of Manhattan that is now over 10 years old. And so this is sort of the seeds that were planted before the pandemic hit. So, this stuff was in the vernacular of New Yorkers, making streets for cyclists, making streets for pedestrians. It wasn't a foreign concept to them. So the pandemic hit, and people realized open space was really important. And the New York City Department of Transportation very quickly launched the Open Streets program, which includes restaurants that were able to put tables and chairs and parking spaces, and just general streets for, turning streets into parks, essentially. As of today, there are 12,000 participants in the Open Restaurants program. And as you can see, about 1,300 have their seating in the roadway only. Some combination 6,400, and there are 360 open streets. Many of those open streets are short, but they're very impactful. So for example, this is Dyckman Street in Upper Manhattan. You can see a very car-dominated space with parking on both sides, parallel parking on the right, and back-end parking on the left, a gas station there. And every weekend during the pandemic, they shut down and it turned into this. And you can just see it's a just much better use of the space. It's generating a lot more economic activity, and it's fun. People are having a really good time. This is Doyer Street in our Chinatown. Believe it or not, cars were allowed on this tiny little street. Some cars are practically as wide as the street, but it got closed down during the pandemic. And now it just received some pavement treatment to make it much more inviting. You can see they put string lights over to make it a more, almost like a living room feel for the neighborhood, which is really, really lovely. This is actually right around the corner for me. This is my neighborhood. I live, if you continue the direction of the cars, 1 block up and down. It's Fifth Avenue. It's a bus route. As you can see, not a whole lot of activity. The street is either jammed with cars during rush hour or totally empty at other times. And that leads to a lot of speeding and a lot of unpleasantness. But on the weekends during the pandemic, it turned into this. Which I think is just another amazing thing. You know, as we were saying, people were looking for more opportunities to do things locally in their neighborhoods. They weren't traveling as far. And this is a really great way to just entice them to spend money locally, to socialize with their neighbors, and have fun. I think one of the kind of crown jewels of the Open Streets program in New York City has been 34th Avenue in Queens. It looks like this. It's got, you know, planted median, parking on both sides, painted bike lanes, and a lot of traffic, but it's a largely residential neighborhood. This is not a commercial strip like Fifth Avenue that I just showed you. And the city shut it down to cars. There are some public schools in the area. There's some parks that extend out into this. And you can see people immediately took to sitting on the median and enjoying the shade trees. And this became so popular and so successful that the city said, well, you know, we could turn it into a linear park. This neighborhood, Jackson Heights in Queens, is rather starved for open space, for green space. And so they proposed something like this that always looks worse on paper in a PDF, but now it looks like this, with painted bicycle lanes that are almost kind of unnecessary because it's just a shared space. You know, signs telling people, go slowly. We've got people exercising. And I think most importantly, just tables so people can sit. And again, this isn't a commercial space. You don't have to spend money to sit out here. You can bring a book, bring your own lunch from home, or just sit and people watch. And it's really quite lovely. The best part about this is that a lot of times when you close streets, as I'm sure people here are aware, there's a lot of pushback from businesses saying, how will people spend money at my establishment? But actually on the car-free streets in New York, the New York City Department of Transportation did a study showing that a lot of restaurants and bars did very well and were able to survive the pandemic when they otherwise might not have. And in fact, some places did better than they did even before the pandemic with the addition of open streets. And it makes sense because some of these restaurants went from having 20 tables inside to 60 tables outside. And this is in my neighborhood. You can see that before the pandemic versus after the pandemic, sales were up 26%, taxable sales. So that's taxable sales, that's tax revenue that goes to the city. It's generating more economic activity than parking, which is metered at about, you know, $1.50, $2 an hour. The probably bad thing is if you see this middle section here, the negative 17%, those are the streets that don't have the open streets. Those are the establishments that are not located on streets where they are closed to cars. So that speaks to the need to expand this, to bring it to more neighborhoods so that those businesses can benefit. And in fact, we're seeing a turnaround where some of those businesses now are saying, hey, bring the open street over here. We want some of that action. I think one of the biggest success stories that we've had in New York, I wanted to talk about the bike network as well. This is Skirmerhorn Street through downtown Brooklyn. It was basically, there's a bike lane under there. You can't see it. You can just see the outer edge of it. It became police officer parking for the local transit police, essentially. But this is a major bike route connecting neighborhoods like where I live to and from the bridges that get you into Manhattan, the Manhattan Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge. And it's just been a problem forever. The cops would park both on the sidewalk and in the bike lane, even to the point where they painted over the bike lane to put in their own reserved parking spaces on what is supposed to be a public street. It says CO there, which is for commanding officer of the precinct. Well, we had a new council member who came in and he promised that he was going to clean this up and solve this problem. Went to DOT, they proposed a new design for this street. No more painted bicycle lanes on both sides, but instead a protected two-way bicycle lane. And this, you can see the pavement was in horrible shape. So when the city came along and said, well, it's time to repave this street, let's put the bike lane in while we're doing that too. And we got this. So, you know, you can just see like such a dramatic change between this. You can see the person on the city bike swerving around the white truck there to this. And you can see here, the UPS truck can still make a delivery without inconveniencing or endangering the cyclists. So I think that's one of the really big, big success stories of the post-pandemic era, if you can call it that.
Not 1 minute, Doug.
Yeah, and these are my concluding slides, actually, so perfect timing. It's funny, we're talking about what we need for the future, right? And how we need to do a rapid transition to really get people out of their cars and really think locally about how they're getting around. But I like to think of this as just a return to the past. This is Mulberry Street in Little Italy in Manhattan in 1900. You can see the street is bustling with commerce. There's no one-way traffic. Everyone's moving in every direction. It's a social space. It's a place for people to buy food, to do business. You can just see even how active like the windows are above it, with people hanging out, looking down over the street. And this is Mulberry Street today. It's certainly not as active. This is the same location, looking in the same direction from here to here. And we know that really all it's going to take to sort of address the challenges of the 21st century are really a kind of 19th century and 20th century approach to how we use our public space. So I want to leave you on that note, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Really, really inspiring. And I think we'll just, since you're about to leave, like everyone who'd like to put forward a question, we'll give some extra time for you right now. So if you...
Yeah, I can hang out for a little bit.
Yeah, if it's possible, just for like a few minutes. And I'll just start off with a question. What about the public support for all these?
Yeah, I'm sure it's very similar elsewhere, and I know it's very similar in places like London. You read about it in the newspapers, and it's it's war on cars, and business owners strike back, and people are rejecting low traffic neighborhoods and things like that. But when you look at the polling here in New York, you see something like 64% support or higher for open streets, for expanding bike share, for expanding protected bicycle lanes. Like, our mayor won with 51% of the vote. So I sometimes joke that open streets and bike lanes and bike share should run for mayor, and probably they'd win in a landslide. So I think when you remove yourself from the media environment and really just talk to people, you see that popular support. And I think, as the pictures demonstrate, people are voting with their feet, they're voting with their dining budgets, they're voting with the time they spend on open streets.
Thanks. And now we've got one more question before you can pop off. What other benefits do you highlight to garner public support? What resonates with people most?
I'll say this as a parent. They closed down Fifth Avenue, and there's still through traffic, but there's no turning traffic on this particular avenue. So now I actually feel comfortable sending my son and daughter, my son is 9, my daughter is 12, up and down the street to run errands for themselves, to go meet a friend, to just go get some candy at the corner store, because I don't have to worry about a car going really fast and a driver turning into them. And so I think the benefit is safety. When you go out there, I've been talking a lot about commerce and how popular this is, but when you go out there, you see people with disabilities, you see elderly people, and you see a lot of children. And I think we need to really, since this really is about the kind of future we're building for our cities and for future generations, you really need to say, and look, it's great as a parent. I don't have to accompany my child everywhere. I can just send them, and I get that free time, they get independence, and everybody wins. I think that's a huge benefit we don't talk about enough, at least here in New York.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And really, thank you so much for sharing, Doug. And I mean, you can always listen to the podcast.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
And I hope to see you again, of course, and good luck.
Yes, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be among all of these great people.
Thank you. And then I think we'll move on directly to Jörgen. And I haven't forgot your question, Nicky, but I'll squeeze it in when there's a good moment. And then I say very, very welcome to Jörgen Larsson, who is associate professor at the Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg. And you're also working in the Mistra Sustainable Consumption project or research project. You can tell us more about that as well, I suppose. And you're also very into air travel, and you'll speak about air travel continuation of low volumes, or back to doubling every 30 years?
Okay.
So, the floor is yours. Thank you, Jörgen.
Thank you. Thank you. So it's now, is it shown the right way, or my slide, or is it?
We see it at least.
You see it, but not. Do you see also like the?
We see the slide as well. I mean,
maybe like, is that better? You see now the presenter mode, or?
No, I don't think so.
No. So this is
but
all right
okay.
then. Okay, great. Okay, thanks for inviting me. Well, unnecessary travel, it's an interesting concept. Economists think that we only have our preferences, but research reveals that people can differentiate between unnecessary consumption and travel and an essential consumption and travel. So even if this is continuously manipulated and needs or wants are turned into needs through advertisement, for example. But so air travel, well, we have, of course, the climate impact from air travel, which is pretty low. We have 2.5% only of carbon dioxide, and then we have the non-CO2 effects, where the scientific evidence is very uncertain still. But this is pretty low levels. But for rich countries like Sweden, it's about 10% of our climate impact that comes from air travel, and it's actually on par with the climate impact from all our car driving. So it's a hugely important aspect. And the title with this doubling is based on the change during the last 30 years before the pandemic, when our travel, the Swedish citizens' travel increased by or it was doubled, and with a 50% increase in carbon emission during the same time. But and looking globally, it's actually even stronger development, with a 200% increase and a doubling of carbon dioxide emission in during these 30 years. So we've seen that with a light small dip when the financial crisis, but it's steadily increasing until the pandemic. Here we see how it's been developing the last couple of years, and now it's increasing. 74% are the latest data from pre-COVID levels.
Now, Jörgen,
okay.
Maybe we don't see the right.
Oh,
I'm not
okay.
sure.
Okay, I've changed a bunch of slides.
We hear what you say, but it.
Yeah. Okay.
I suspect there might be.
Let me see what's wrong then. Maybe.
Now we see. Yes.
No. Okay, but no. Okay. Does it work like that? Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. Tell me if it doesn't work again. Yes. So yeah, here we see now you see the development the last couple of years.
Now we see the global air passenger volumes.
Yeah, great. Okay, so it seems like we're fast picking up on pre-COVID levels. So this is still when there are many restrictions in Asia. So I guess we will come back to yearly fast increasing levels, and of course that's problematic. We did a research for the Swedish Parliament recently, and we found that with radical policies for technological change and a 50% reduction in travel volumes, we might achieve necessary emission reductions. So the idea that renewable energy, for example, electrofuels and electric aircrafts, that can be sufficient. We don't find any evidence for that for the next 30 or 40 years or so, maybe after that. So we need a reduction in air travel volumes. So what does that imply? Well, one thing is that it implies that we also need to reduce private air travel. Only 20% of emissions are from business flights for the Swedish case. And also that only 40% of emissions are from intra-EU flights for Swedes. So also intercontinental flights must decrease. And so what ways do we then have for reduced air travel volumes? Well, one is, of course, that we can change the norms and behaviors on a voluntary basis among individuals. And Greta has contributed to this, and the flight shame movement, or as I think it's more accurate, it has to do with a voluntary ambition to contribute to decreasing the climate problems, not rather than something that has to do with the shame. And I've been involved in different initiatives for supporting such a change in voluntary behavioral change. One is a web tool called Flight Emission Map, where you directly can see the air travel emissions from different destinations. This is to show that when you are to choose your vacation destination, having a close one is much better than a remote one, which is obvious, but people don't usually think that way. Another tool is called the travelandclimate.org, where you can write where you want to go, and you can get an estimate of the emissions based on the different transport modes that you choose. And the last initiative I was involved in is called trainbike.org. It's a vacation form when you take the train to somewhere and you bike tour at this place. So then what about these voluntary initiatives? Can we expect them to be enough? Well, I don't think so. We need societal solutions, of course, also. And one important and often forgotten way is that we need to do investments for better alternative travel modes. We cannot expect people to choose staycation to a large extent instead of air travel. So we need to find better modes like high-speed rail, for example, or night trains, or long-distance electric cars, or something in the future. But then finally, I don't think these two will be sufficient, because as we get richer, we increase the number of kilometers traveled. This is a research where they follow what happens with the kilometers traveled over time as people get richer and richer and have higher incomes. So the evidence is very clear that as we get richer and get higher incomes, we travel further and further. And when we are fairly poor, we do this on land transport. But when we come above a certain level, then we do not have time anymore to travel slow on the ground, and so we start flying. And for Swedes now, almost half of our traveled kilometers are by air travel, and the rest is land-based travel. So it is very hard to imagine that as we get richer, we can still keep people from flying. That is very hard to see. And my main idea about what could make a real possibility here is air passenger taxes. That is that we tax air tickets, and they can be viewed as a compensation for the exemptions of VAT and the CO2 tax that we have for international air travel. And they also need to increase with the distance. So the further the flight, the higher the air passenger tax. And if they are designed as a frequent flyer tax, it might also gain a wider public support than a regular tax or a flat tax. So, and as you know, the air travel is very unequally distributed. We have a small portion in society that is doing most of the flying. And an air passenger tax needs to be very high because people do want to fly. So if they shall avoid or decrease the flying for financial reasons, then the tax must be very high. So we have air passenger taxes in many countries, but they're usually very low. So they don't really have any measurable effect. But they also need to
1 minute.
Okay. The taxes also need to increase over time as our incomes are getting higher and higher. Normally, that's not the case right now when we have a decrease in real wages. But if they continue to rise, we need to also rise air passenger taxes every year. And finally, they can be beneficial for the economy if income taxes are reduced. Taxes are distorting economy, and income taxes are keeping people from working, and work is usually beneficial for society. So if we switch tax from income taxes to, for example, air travel taxes, there is a good chance that the economy will function better and we will have lower unemployment, etc. So there are many win-win aspects to very high air passenger taxes. That was my final comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. And I know you've also been doing research on like the public support for air travel taxes. Would you like to just say a couple of words on that?
Well, there are many things to be said, but and taxes are unpopular even in a tax-loving country like Sweden, and it's yet unclear whether the frequent flyer tax is actually more popular than the regular flight tax. So it remains. It's hard to investigate something that people never heard about before to get a good impression on that. But then another point is that policy instruments that are aiming to go directly at the airline industry are more popular than the ones focusing on the passenger. So for example, EU has a long list of very stringent policies that are likely to be decided upon next year, and they're all aiming to hit the company mainly to get technological changes in place, but they will also increase the cost for flights, which will decrease flying a bit. So I guess that's the more popular way to go about. But our research shows that it will not be enough to go only for the technological change.
Thank you very much, and you'll stay on so we can put forward more questions to you later on. Thank you very, very much. And then I say welcome to Lucy Gilliam, Senior Shipping Policy Advisor at Seas at Risk. So what can we learn about the future for shipping from the COVID pandemic and supply chain chaos? Very welcome.
Let me just get my slides up and share my screen, but I've got to choose the right one, screen 2. There we go. So share that one. Now I need to be able to see my slides. Okay. Yes, brilliant. Well, I'm going to talk about something slightly different in that I'm not talking about personal travel, but talking about the shipping industry and what lessons that we might have learnt from quite an interesting time. I think shipping really kind of got on the radar in the last couple of years for a number of reasons. So I'm going to go through those now. Just to give a little bit of an introduction. So I work for Seas at Risk. We're an umbrella organisation in Brussels representing ocean NGOs across Europe, and we've got 32 different members. And we're involved in advocacy for policy to protect the ocean, working on all sorts of issues that are listed here in my presentation. So a little bit of background, why work on shipping? What's the problem in the first place? Well, ships are some of the biggest machines that, that we build. They consume huge amounts of heavy fuel, they contribute towards air pollution, climate pollution, but they also have a whole host of other impacts on the marine environment that won't necessarily be solved just by switching to cleaner, more renewable fuels. Overall, shipping is contributing 1 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalents a year, so it has the emissions of Germany. So definitely something that needs to be tackled and cannot be left out of any kind of climate initiatives. It's also a significant source of air pollution, so contributing towards poor air quality for port and coastal communities. This is partly because ships currently burn some of the most kind of toxic residual fuels like heavy fuel oil, which is, you know, one step away from kind of asphalt or tar. To date, we do have a greenhouse gas strategy at the International Maritime Organization, but the current strategy is not sufficient to align with Paris Agreement limits. So this strategy is due to be revised at the end of this year to start the negotiations for new measures and to raise the ambition. So at the moment, the current target is to reduce emissions by 50% by 2050 and aim for higher ambition, which is clearly not what we need to be doing if we're limiting climate heating to 1.5 degrees. So that's a little bit of a background on the problem. But what I want to, talk about is some of the interesting things that came out of the pandemic. So when COVID hit, one of the very first victims of the pandemic in the news was the cruise industry. So cruising kind of almost stopped overnight. We saw situations like Diamond Princess, which had more than 700 cases of COVID on board. And cruise ships actually, you know, they kind of ended up being a symptom of virus spread around the globe and actually contributed towards spreading COVID around the world, including into the US. So, wait a second, I'll just get my notes up. Move this over. So it led to a situation where, you know, borders are shut and staff trapped on ships and passengers, you know, really struggling to get home. There also ended up being a kind of a situation where ships were left idling off coast for months on end. This actually led to quite a number of kind of grassroots groups getting in contact with us. Cruise ships became really visible, and groups that, you know, were active on ocean issues in like Southampton, for example, or Portland, or, you know, off the coast in the Netherlands, were kind of writing to us and asking about cruise ships and what their contribution to air pollution was. But it also led to, you know, a number of cruise companies going bust and a record amount of scrappage of vessels in shipbreaking yards. There were some positives from the stopping of cruise ships. There were stories in Venice of dolphins returning to the lagoon and clearer waters from the reduction in cruise shipping. So it definitely, like, this was kind of something that was very kind of key in the news. And I think, you know, since then, people have really been questioning, like, cruising, you know, as a as an industry, and there have been sort of greater moves to really push the industry to kind of to clean up as a kind of very visible yeah, they have lots of environmental consequences. So, another kind of a visible shipping issue during the pandemic was kind of supply chain chaos. We saw, first of all, that there were shutdowns of industries around the world due to lockdowns, production centers in China being shut down because of COVID, reduced industrial activity. So there was actually a reduction in kind of shipping at the beginning of the pandemic. But things started to change as kind of policies kind of came in to support people for home working or, being furloughed, etc. And then we saw a boom in shipping, which led to all sorts of supply chain bottlenecks. So we saw lots of ships waiting in LA, waiting to get into berth and to unload and stuff. And there were lots of distributors of goods that were unable to, get their supply. We ended up with a situation where goods that had been ordered for kind of Halloween festivities didn't actually get delivered until after the Christmas break. So a lot of waste creation, a lot of chaos, and a big boom in shipping. And we've seen like the container shipping companies, freight rates have gone up. It's been really kind of a boom time in terms of profit, but with lots of knock-on consequences for the economy. This had some kind of impacts around the world. I attended an UNCTAD meeting this summer where countries in the global south, the developing south, talked about the problems that had resulted for them from COVID, where freight rates had become very, very expensive if they could access shipping services at all. Because what had happened is, because there was a boom in demand in kind of North American and European economies for goods like furniture or supplies for working from home, or things to occupy your time because people had more leisure time, they weren't eating out because of lockdowns, etc. But this meant that there was a shift, and so in some parts of the world they had less shipping services while we had kind of an excess in other parts of the world. We had situations like car chip issues where this have knock-on effects through the supply chain. So what I'm saying here is that with these examples, the pandemic highlighted how interconnected and easily destabilized global supply chains can be. It really kind of brought shipping into the public consciousness. Like, usually this is an industry that's completely out of sight and out of mind. It's on the high seas, and most people haven't really had like an experience, realize, what's going on, how many ships there are plying the seas. So it became more visible. And I guess one of the things that is maybe positive that comes out of this is people are starting to consider whether, we need to make supply chains more resilient. Perhaps we need to reshore certain industries in order to prevent future supply chain shocks. Okay, another unforgettable moment that happened during the pandemic was when a giant ship called the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal and blocked the waterway for 6 days. It disrupted billions of dollars of global trade before it was freed. And it led to all sorts of interesting articles where people talked about, what were the products that actually were stuck on board, like IKEA furniture and blow up dolls and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. But one of the immediate kind of impacts of this Suez Canal crash was not to question like what we're shipping and why, but it was to say, oh my goodness, we need more big ships, therefore we must immediately start expanding the Suez Canal. And so that's already happened. They're already looking to expand this, because the idea is that we need more and more of these bigger ships. And there wasn't any questioning of whether, do we really need to ship all of these things,
Now I say 1 minute. 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Oh goodness, I'm not going to get through all my slides. All of these stories led me to really think, to think about shipping and to think about system change and think, you know, are we getting to the end of kind of the big boat era? Should ships and ship sizes be growing ever more? And, you know, is this really efficient? And, you know, what are the consequences of actually, you know, not only like the fuel that's been burnt by these ships, but also the products and the global trade that's enabled by this sort of shipping? Oh, wait, sorry. And to ask the question of, do we need big ships in the future? So I included this slide because, you know, one of the pieces of work that I initiated, you know, out of the pandemic was this idea to look at shipping system change and ask the question of what does shipping look like within planetary boundaries? And we're already exceeding planetary boundaries for many, many things, including like, you know, plastics and pollution, etc. And you know, the idea is, you know, the scenarios and the projections from the industry that shipping is going to double or treble by 2050, and this whole idea kind of made alarm bells ring in my head, because I was like, if shipping is doubling or trebling, then all of the things that have been carried by ships, all the production and the materials and the energy would also be doing so, because ships, they carry material things. They don't carry kind of goods and services, things that are in the cloud or the ether. So it led me to initiate this project, which I call One Planet Shipping, which is basically looking at shipping within planetary boundaries. And I've also got some slides on the policy that we're advocating for. The reason why I'm developing this system change narrative is I think it's very important to have a vision of the future that's you know, that is within that context, to make sure that we're developing policy that is fit for purpose, it's for the right scale, that we're not investing in ships or infrastructure that are going to end up being stranded assets or too big, or, you know, don't fit the economy that we have in the future. So I'll leave it at that. If people want to know the ins and outs of the policy that we're working on and some of the things that we're advocating for, then I'm happy to be in touch and talk about the work that we're doing at the International Maritime Organization and advocating for within the European Green Deal.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Really interesting. And I really, yeah, you're really right that the shipping and the, yeah, everything connected to that really came up to the light during the pandemic. And also the principle of just in time, at least, I mean, people who've been working against highways from the environmental movement have known this concept for long, but now this was like discussed in the public debate, at least in Sweden. How do you look upon that principle? Can you see any, I mean, are there any changes to come, or is everything just business as usual?
Yeah, I mean, this just-in-time delivery has certainly been kind of a hot topic, you know, in kind of the shipping world. We've got just-in-time deliveries because it enables us to save on things like warehousing and storing, but it does require the constant engine of marketing and sales, you know, to keep the products moving through the pipeline. And of course, you know, in the good times, you know, things have flowed, but, you know, you get a little change, like, you know, a factory shuts down, or truck drivers go on strike, or, you know, ships all come at once, then that becomes not possible. And this is one of the things about the idea of the efficiency of big ships. Yes, big ships are efficient when you just look at how much fuel they burn per ton nautical mile, but they become less efficient and more expensive if they take longer to unload in port, or if there's nowhere for the products to go that are being unloaded, so you've therefore got to store them, or there ends up being too many things that it ends up overwhelming the kind of the hinterland kind of trains and supply chains. So just in time delivery, it's, you know, that's very fragile. And I think people are looking at that now to say, you know, is that sensible and resilient, especially in the context of more and more kind of extreme weather and environmental change, which you know, the maritime industry is particularly vulnerable if we think of the, you know, tipping points like, you know, sea level rise, more extreme weather, etc. So yeah, definitely it's become a resilience issue for the industry.
Thank you so much, Lucy, and you'll stay on as well for the discussion and the questions. And then I say very, very welcome to Jakop Dalunde. I say it in Swedish, or Jacob, I don't know, in English, your family name, but very, very welcome. You're a member of the European Parliament, and you're here to give some European and political perspectives on lessons from the pandemic and the transport sector. Very, very welcome, Jacob.
Thanks, Anna. And I will begin, however, with a bit of a local perspective, because one of the things that really has struck me, in the sense that it's not, of course, a new take, that the pandemic has been an acceleration of the green transition that we have known for quite a while now. But one of the examples that I've seen is that when there becomes a mind shift away from thinking that you will go into the office every day, when that norm begins to change, that also helps the norm change in whether you need to own your own car and therefore need to use that car every day. Because the less often you use your car, the more likely you are to opt, instead of owning your own car, you might instead participate in a carpool. I have myself never owned a car, and I've never felt the need to. Oftentimes, I've been interested in using a car every now and then, especially when I'm on vacation. You want to go to some Tuscan city on a hill or experience something, but you don't really want to. You don't need to own a car. And many of the traditional rental services are quite cumbersome. It's difficult. There's a lot of paperwork. But what's now emerging are these more accessible carpooling services. I've used M-Mobility, or now Volvo On Demand in Stockholm, or Cambio in Brussels. And given that they are now much more available, enables people to stop owning your car, instead using it only when you need to. Regardless if that is renting it once or twice per week to commute to work, or using it once or twice per month for a weekend getaway. When that mind shift starts to change, that enables another mind shift in city planning. Because if every citizen or a tenant living in a building, when you no longer need to plan for one car per person, that enables an entirely new way of thinking when it comes to planning your cities, and having less parking spaces for every house, and therefore enabling more greenery, nicer streets, and this will be really acceleration in that perspective in city planning. We've already seen it in some of our cities, like in Paris. We've seen it in New York. But now I think other cities where you would not normally see this green transition to start to take place. Now, of course, one might say, well, not everybody can work from home. A lot of people who working in the kinds of jobs where you need to be there physically, sure. But many of those kinds of workers did not necessarily commute by car every day from the beginning. They might have used public transport or biking or walking. So when that crucial demographic, who might be very politically influential, no longer demand city planning, no longer demand infrastructure for daily car usage, when they no longer demand that, they might be few, but they are politically important, and that enables that paradigm shift in political planning. This will then, of course, have implication for our both national but also European political planning for infrastructure. And now we are working on AFIR, which is the abbreviation for the alternative infrastructure planning, which we are now adopting and mandating the member states to have charging stations every 6 kilometers, which is badly needed. I've used an electric car many times in Sweden, and while there's of course room for improvement in making sure that we have more charging stations, the situation is much worse in other parts of Europe. Just the other week, I rented an electric car to go to see the fantastic southern part of Belgium, the Ardennes forest. And I almost ended up in a really bad situation because of the lack of access to charging. Not only the actual lack of the charging stations, I couldn't find quite many of them, but too many of them were not accessible for a person who was not a permanent resident of Belgium, and you didn't have access to a pre-purchased card that you could use to blip against the charging station. You could not use a traditional bank card, or you couldn't download an app. And now this will...
1 minute, Jacob.
Yes. But I wanted to mention one other paradigm shift, which is night trains. I've spoken with ÖBB, who of the Austrian railway company. They said that the pandemic was a big hit for them, and it was difficult not only for other parts of the economy, for aviation, but the railway sector was also badly hit by the pandemic. But the first part of the railway sector to recover much quicker than the rest was the night trains, because people perceived as a closed compartment was much more pandemic safe, which accelerated the renaissance of the night trains. And now every month you see a member state announcing new night trains. And I think this will be really pivotal in enabling both reducing road traffic for passengers, but also aviation. Night trains will be not the silver bullet, but quite close to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and very inspiring. Night trains are really magic, like seems to be to me. Just one follow-up question, and you'll stay on for a while, but not the whole session.
Yes.
Other things to do afterwards. But just wanted to ask you, do you feel? I mean, the link to the pandemic and the transport sector was very clear, but now we have an energy price crisis. What's the discussion, a connection to the transport sector? Do you see any, or is that a discussion, or is it mainly the electric issues that are energy? Yeah, you see my question.
Yes, well, I think the energy crisis helps us frame the question, not only going from fossil internal combustion car to electric cars. That is of course good, but there's one other paradigm shift that we need, looking at inherently inefficient modes of transportation in terms of energy transfer, where the car is quite inefficient, even if you have an electric car, and the same thing with trucks shipping goods, because of you lose so much energy in the connection between the rubber wheels and the asphalt road. And the railway sector is much more energy efficient because of you lose less energy in the transfer between the steel wheels of the train and the steel tracks of the tracks. And even when we use electricity, even from renewables, we still need to be energy efficient. And I think that will, and the energy crisis with the war in Ukraine helps us with that. And that would be important even without this energy crisis, because even renewables have an environmental footprint. So we cannot only solve the energy, the climate change crisis or the sustainability crisis with going to renewables, because even renewables also have an environmental footprint. So we need to be energy efficient as well. And the energy crisis helps us in that transition in our way of thinking as well.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And thanks for coming. We say, you'll stay for a while, and we'll see if we get more opportunities to ask questions. And so thank you. And then I say very, very welcome to Jens Holm. You have also been a member of the European Parliament, and you're now member of the City Council of Stockholm, and you've also been a member of the Swedish Parliament, where you were also chairing, I don't know if this is the right word in English, but like the traffic committee, infrastructure committee?
Transport committee, yes. Transport, yes.
Yes, and you were also chairing this committee during the pandemic. So I guess you have heard many discussions on like should we shut down air travel and reactions in different political parties. So welcome, Jens.
Thank you very much, Anna. And very well, all presentations have been very interesting. And I think the first and most important lesson that we can draw from the pandemic is that there is a readiness for political action, and there is also a political support for such an action when people understand that we are facing an external threat, such as the COVID-19 crisis. So we can look upon this pandemic as a rehearsal for the real transition, which is, of course, the climate transition. And when it comes to the transport sector, we saw so many fundamental changes that that took place in a very short period of time, and many examples have already been given out, especially by Doug, who talked about the open streets. That was in New York, but we had the open streets examples in all major cities all over the world, I would say. And what happened was that the car space was replaced and converted into pedestrian areas, cycling lanes, pop-up lanes, outdoor restaurant spaces, and pop-up green areas, and so on. And we could see that those actions, they were usually very well received among the local population. I think the big challenge we have now as both policymakers and also as green and red activists is to continue to use this momentum. And I'm a little bit afraid that we are gradually losing the momentum. But we saw during the pandemic that yes, we can take political action to change people's behavior. And if people can see that, yes, we receive something in return, there is a readiness. People are okay with such political action. So if I should single out some areas that I think is very important for just transition of the transport sector, well, the first area is to continue to convert car space into other purposes, space for pedestrians, for cyclists, for green areas, and so on. And we can use that by taxing cars. We can have car-free areas in our cities. We can take one car lane and convert that into something else. I mean, there are many examples of political action that we can take. I think it's also very important where it's possible to promote home working. We saw during the pandemic, many people thought that everybody were working from home. We know that that was not the case. In Sweden, 1/3 of the population worked from home all days in the week, or 1 or 2 days during the week. So 2/3 did actually not work from home. But although only by 30% working from home on an occasional basis, that changed a lot. And if we can continue to promote home working, that means that we will have less commuting to the workplaces. We will also continue to have empty office areas. And I think that is a very interesting example. In some cities, I think in New York, I know in Copenhagen, and I know some other cities, there has been a very proactive working with converting office areas into dwellings, into meeting spaces, and so on. And that could help us to solve the conflict with the building more dwellings, building more residential areas, but still keeping our green areas in a city. If we can build on what we already have, if we can convert office areas, we don't have to build so much. And I think there's a lot of political work to do here. Finally, two things more. Jörgen Larsson mentioned the aviation sector, and that is, of course, extremely important. And we can see now that the aviation sector is bouncing back. Continue to work on taxing aviation, extremely important, but also shutting down airports. And the Swedes here, we know that we had a huge discussion about the Bromma airport, which is located in the central part of Stockholm. Actually, the government took a decision to shut down the Bromma airport, but that was stopped by my conservative colleagues in the transport committee, unfortunately. But we should continue to work to reduce areas for aviation, basically. Finally, public transport. During the pandemic, well, in Sweden and in other areas, the public transport sector lost about 50% of their passengers. And still, the public transport sector is working very hard to bring back those passengers. I think during the pandemic, we had almost like a stigma on transporting with the public transport. We had a recommendation from the authorities to avoid traveling with the metro, with bus, and so on. And we have to build up the confidence for public transportation again, because without a well-functioning system of public transportation, it will be very hard to have a just transition of the transport sector. And
1 minute.
Yes, and there is also many things that we can do on a policy level here. First, we need to continue to subsidize public transportation, and not only subsidize by taxing locally or regionally. In Sweden, we had some governmental support during the pandemic, although it was not sufficient, but that is an example that the state has to step in order to save the public transport system and build back the confidence. I think also as green organizations, as environmental organizations, it's very important to work together with the public transportation authorities and so on to build back this confidence. So hopefully we can see the pandemic as a rehearsal for the big and the most important transition, the climate transition. But there is still a lot of things that we have that we need to do, a lot of lessons that still can be learned from the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jens. And yeah, it's a good word to see it as a rehearsal. And you also spoke about that, yeah, maybe we're about to lose the momentum, but how do you see, like, just quick thoughts, how do you think, how can we keep the momentum?
By working on what worked well during the pandemic and those things that were popular. For instance, the open streets example, because that is very concrete for people. You can see it. Oh wow, this street is empty from cars. There is open air restaurants. People can walk here. There is no risk of being run down by a lorry or a car or something. And also my example of converting office areas into dwellings and other purposes. I think that is also something that people really can understand. What is the purpose of having empty offices in a city center? No purpose at all. If we can see that we can build 500 apartments for students, well, people would love such an example. So try to find these examples that were popular and continue to work on those.
Thank you so much. That links very well onto the question I'm going to put forward to Nicky. But meanwhile, I will, everyone who has questions, we have a couple of minutes, like quarter of an hour left of the webinar. So please do write your questions to our fantastic speakers, and you'll get like 1 or 2 minutes thinking about that, and at the same time listening to Nicky's response on this question, since it links. I mean, Jens ended up with the importance of stories, and that's exactly what you were working with in the Rapid Transition Alliance. And so I just like to ask you, in these briefings and the work you've done on the lessons from the pandemic, do you have a favorite story?
Of the pandemic. Actually, I think, as often is the case, sometimes the favourite stories are ones that touch you personally. I always think it's interesting when people bring their own stories in, it sort of comes alive. And around in my area, which is in quite a rural part of the west of England in Somerset, we had a sort of local group that didn't exist before, but just came spontaneously into being through using WhatsApp and helping people out in the village. And what happened quite quickly was a way of sharing the people who were able to drive still, and obviously there are lots of people who were shielding in their home and not going out at all. Those people took upon themselves to organise a rota of people going to collect prescriptions from doctor surgeries, going to collect food from a local food service that started up cooking using waste food. All these things emerged in this sort of vacuum, I suppose. Suddenly, some people had time and they chose to use it in a way that, I don't know, economists would probably tell us that they wouldn't do that because it doesn't make sense, but it did make sense and it worked very well. So my favourite examples are at that very low level where people just step up and do things. And I think sometimes we need to, if it's possible for policy to enable that to happen, it works really well and people are imaginative. And if we're allowed to use our imagination, it really does bring forward good ideas, like carpooling and car sharing that other speakers are talking about. You know, those come from local governments, those have come from people just thinking we should set up a car sharing scheme. And so to take the idea of something that probably starts quite small and to then roll it out, that's the kind of thing that we're interested in at the Alliance as well. So you see a small example that happens in one place and you think, could you turn this into policy, or could you turn this into practice, into best practice?
Thank you, Nicky. So what about now the questions? Let's see if these are questions or comments. How is this a comment? No, let's see. Or now I get a bit confused. Freddie, are these questions? How do we keep all the amazing potential revealed by these pandemic examples under the noses of decision makers? That's a question, I think. Any comments? Yes, it is a question. Can you see them in the chat? Anyone who'd like to go for it? We have decision makers in the panelists. We have NGOs, we have researchers.
I mean, partly we're doing it now, aren't we? We're talking about it. So I think partly it's to keep that in the public, in the open domain, and to keep speaking about it, because I worry that somebody else mentioned the opportunity is still here, but is it slipping away slightly? It's really important to remind ourselves what we were capable of and to keep that feeling alive and the examples alive.
Thank you, Jakop.
So one thing that I would think it would be really good in terms of, it was one question was, if each panelist was given total control of a transport policy, what would we do? And I'm not necessarily in favor of like silver bullet mentality. There's never like one thing to do, but one thing that could have enormous impact would be a good trajectory of increased carbon pricing. And Norway is one of the few countries, if to my knowledge, the only one that has done so. Sweden currently has the world's highest carbon pricing, 120 euros per ton. But Norway has announced a trajectory to go to 200 euros per ton by 2030. And the benefit of not doing a decision 1 year and increasing it the next, and instead in announcing a trajectory with an increase for the future, is that you can affect planning, both in terms of people making their purchases, politicians thinking about city planning, companies investing in R&D for future projects, is that if you announce that something will be quite more expensive in 10 years, you can start affecting the change, but you have more of that upside in that people start accustoming themselves to this future, but you get less of the penalty in the sense that poorer people who cannot, as of yet, afford either buying an electric car, funding renovation of your home, you can still plan for that future, but you don't have to pay the carbon tax immediately. But you can already take decisions with that in mind already. And of course, this would be even better for the European perspective to some extent. The ETS has a trajectory, not for the carbon price necessarily, but rather for the reduction. But that trajectory is far too weak, in my opinion. And if we had a much stronger trajectory for how fast emissions will decrease, you can get a much more results without necessarily having to increase the trajectory from 1 year to the next. But if you commit to a much stronger trajectory, both in 10 years' time and 20 years' time, then you can affect much more change. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to answer this tricky question? So if you were to give in total control of the transport policy, what would you do? Lucy?
Yeah, I answered in the chat.
Yeah, you did. Okay, and you can answer it here as well.
On a personal level, for me, the thing that would make a huge difference is restricting cars. I think this is a thing that is like would be a game changer. And yeah, just restricting cars around schools. I think that this should be a no-brainer. So yeah, to I guess yeah, restrict cars, and I would design cities and transport infrastructure, you know, from kind of a child perspective, like that kind of mentality. Because if you're designing for children, then you're making it safe for people with disabilities. You're making it safe for there to be access for people that are on, you know, those like electric wheelchairs and stuff. You make the city much more accessible. So that's not on shipping, but I think if we did restrict cars, it would reduce some demand for shipping services, because there's lots of car parts and lots of cars that actually get shipped around the world. And yeah, this came into the public consciousness when there was a giant car carrier with electric cars that like sunk off the Azores and caught fire. But on shipping, I agree with Jakop that we need a carbon price. That would also be a game changer. So one for overall transport, but one for shipping.
And thank you. And I was just about to put forward the question to Jörgen, but then he has to leave because of fire alarm. So we say just very, very many thanks to you, Jörgen, and maybe we can come back to you another time. And I hope it's not a real fire. I hope it's just a rehearsal. So Jens.
Make public transport.
Thanks to you. Just thanks to Jakop is also leaving here.
Okay. Make public transport cheaper and more accessible for more people. What we've seen is that actually the price of travel with public transport in many countries have increased very much. Before the Putin war in Ukraine, the price on traveling with the public transport actually increased much more than traveling with the private car. And my vision is to have a free fare system in the public transport, such as they have in Tallinn, in Luxembourg, in Dunkirk, in northern France, and many other French cities. And I think, that would have been, we would see so many benefits with that, from a class perspective, from an inclusive city perspective, easiness perspective. When it comes to public transport today, it's complicated for people that don't travel so often in public transport. How does this ticket system work? And people tend to avoid public transport because they are afraid of making wrong, stepping up on the bus without a ticket because they don't know where to buy a ticket and so on. So a free fare system would be fantastic.
Thank you, Jens. And then Nicky.
I was going to say the same thing as Jens. I was going to say that I think free public transport will be really helpful. It's the thing that always comes up whenever you speak to people. If you ask them why don't they go on by train, why don't they go by bus, it's a circular thing. It's too expensive and the buses are empty because it's too expensive, or the routes are too long and too infrequent because it's expensive. And I think it just needs to become a norm. And I don't know whether you could do it sort of imaginatively. So, for example, you can't use your car on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Or you can't start with you can't use your car on Wednesdays, or whatever it is that enables something very simple that everybody can get behind, and we understand why we're doing it, but it enables people to try it out, to taste the change, and to have a go. Because I think very often people just, as Jens said, they're sometimes quite nervous about it, even about some people haven't travelled by bus since they were children.
Yeah.
And particularly outside of cities again, and I'm in a rural place, so we struggle with we have way too many vehicles, and it also isn't good for community, because you tend to, sometimes you don't even know people who live just half a mile down the lane because you're passing each other in your cars rather than walking. Whereas in the city, you know, when I have lived in cities, I walk a lot more.
Thank you. So many wise words. And we have 3 minutes left. And I'd just like to ask, first, thanks to everyone, Lucy, Jens, Nicky, and also Jörgen and Doug, and who left more? Jakop. But as a last thing, I'd just like to ask to the panelists, as well as the attendees, just write in the chat, if you're an attendee, one word of what you will bring on from this webinar in your, and also to you panelists, as one word, what will you bring from this conversation? Stories, Lucy says, take the bus. It's okay with routes. Possibilities, that our cities can be so much better. Good examples. Yes, I totally agree. And would you like to say anything, Nicky, about your, just last 2 minutes? What's your next plans in the Rapid Transition Alliance?
Yeah, just to say that we're sort of continuing looking back over the pandemic as and building on that with positive examples, and sort of continuing to track that work. And we're also interested in working with anybody else. I know some of your work separately, but it would be good to keep in touch, maybe have a look at the website and join up, and then we're able to share your work, what you're doing, and also come back to you perhaps for future examples, because I think, you know, the bringing stuff into the real world seems to be what enables people to see it's possible. So look at how we reacted to those 2 photographs that Doug had, when he had the photograph of the before and after. My first thought was, I want those photos. I want to use them for campaigning. So yes, I would like to stay in touch and to learn what we can from each other. We need to support each other in this, and the network of networks is vital.
Thank you so much for joining, and thanks to you speakers, thanks to all the attendees, and we'll also record this and share, so feel free to share afterwards.